Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Cameron Esposito. Cameron is a Los Angeles-based stand-up comic, actor, and writer. She has appeared in multiple TV shows and movies and at comedy and music festivals worldwide. Her podcast, Queery, explores individual stories of identity, personality, and the shifting cultural matrix around gender, sexuality, and civil rights. Today we talk about her just-released first book, Save Yourself, which is a memoir that tackles the big issues explored in her comedy, including gender, sexuality, and feminism, and how her Catholic childhood prepared her for a career as an outspoken lesbian comedian in ways the Pope could never have imagined. To learn more, visit CameronEsposito.com. Hi, Cameron. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you so much.
So, Cameron, I thought I would have you tell us a little bit about your new book that's coming out, or that is actually out now as this airs, but is coming out tomorrow as we're recording this. Save Yourself, and just a little bit about what people can expect.
So it's a book about growing up super Catholic and wanting to be a priest and then ending up gay stand-up comic instead.
So I also grew up Catholic, but I grew up in the suburbs of LA. So it sounds like it was a fairly different experience than what you did growing up in the Chicago area. But I'm curious if you could tell us the story of how you first thought about becoming a priest.
Can I ask you a question before we get into that? When you say it was a different experience, did you go to Catholic school when you were a kid?
I did, yeah.
Till what age?
I actually, not because my parents asked me to, but I went to Catholic school all the way through college.
Wow. And your experience in the suburbs of LA, when you say it was different, how did it feel different than what I've described or what you've heard me talk about? I'm just so curious because I don't, I only know my own experience.
Yeah. Well, I feel like maybe just because it was LA and it was California, even though it was in the 80s, it felt a little bit more liberal. And I never got any direct messages from my community or my church about that being gay was a bad thing, or they need to be saved, or they needed to be changed, or anything like that. And I even distinctly remember one particular mass, the priest saying that we needed to accept gay people who may or may not have been in the congregation. And so I'm just assuming that based on what you've said about your experience, it was very different.
Yeah, what's wild to me about that is that does not mirror my experience at all. And also, I certainly know other folks who've had more that sort of relationship. And I can't tell what is weirder because, and I don't mean to typify your life as weird, but I just mean because that, going to Catholic school or going to church and hearing that kind of messaging when that's not what is being taught, like sort of at the highest offices, is also strange to me. Because going to a Jesuit college, which is like the more liberal wing of things, they're even, the head of my theology department was a very liberal, secular person, not a priest. And so to me, it's all confusing because it's also confusing to become a theology professor, head a department, and be teaching personally, that like queerness might be okay or that it's all right if priests are married. But then that's not what the larger institution is teaching. I think that's also a specifically Catholic experience because a lot of like more evangelical Christian faiths, there isn't necessarily that disconnect between what people are doing in churches and what's being taught on high. That's like a very Catholic experience. So your experience is also like a very sort of typically Catholic experience.
Yeah.
Which is that like...
Yeah, I also went to a Jesuit university, but it was here in San Francisco. So you can only imagine how liberal that was.
So that's wild too, because then it's like, well, what are we holding on to? Anyway, we can come back to that. But you were going to ask about what made me want to be a priest. Well, when I was a kid, I was an altar server, which is like a priest assistant. And there were not women who did that. I don't want to say job because whatever, that task. Until my sister's 3 years older than me, she was like the first group of people where women could do that. So I opted into being an altar server, which meant that like as a little kid, I would get up and it was a rotating schedule. So it's not like this was every day, but go serve at mass before going to school. So, I mean, just thinking about this being, like 11 or whatever and going and having like a job that starts at, I think that the masses that we did were 8:00 mass.
So this was on the weekday.
Yeah, you'd go there and then because my school was attached to the church, like they shared a parking lot and some buildings. So yeah, you'd go work at mass and then like go to school. Maybe it was even 7:00 mass because then we had to get to school on time. So yeah, I mean, very early already like above and beyond in terms of maybe what other 11-year-olds were doing.
Yeah, I was also an altar server. And when I started, I wonder if your sister's about the same age as me, because it was also around the same time when they started letting women or girls be altar servers as well. And it was kind of a big deal. But they never had altar servers during the week. They just had them on the weekends. So that's kind of intense that you would get up extra early to go do that before you went to school and then you do that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was into it. I thought it was the best. I mean, I felt like very holy doing it. I would feel, because you get to go into the room where the priest gets dressed and, see them put on the elaborate outfits. I'm going to use secular words that then they would wear out. But also, I would see the host, which is like the little cracker that you get to eat, comes in like a big giant bulk plastic bag. Like it looks like how you would buy Cheetos from Costco or whatever. And to see the priest, unziplocking that and then taking handfuls of host out and putting it into a chalice, it felt really cool to me to be behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's like the backstage pass of church.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But all the other Catholics who are just sitting in the sanctuary don't get to see.
Yeah, a bunch of stooges. They don't even know what the plastic bag looks like that the host comes in.
So what was it in particular about that experience, though, that made you go, I think I want to do that?
Well, really, I just didn't have a better understanding of how to connect with community. For me, like, again, it's getting up in the morning, going, like, just using that as one example. To be a child and have a mission like that, that before school even, I'm going to directly serve my community. I'm going to touch crackers that are the actual body of Jesus, a real person who was also really God. I just think it had this like very heightened sense of life. Like life felt very big and important and meaningful. And then as I continued in high school and college, the things that I did that felt the most meaningful were usually things that had an intersection with the church, because the church is very good at finding things that will feel meaningful. I mean, it's meaningful to stand in a room full of people and say the same words. It's meaningful to travel to other parts of the country and connect with people there. Like whether or not it was helpful when I did things like go on solidarity trips and like build houses as a teenager with no construction skills. Like I'm not sure that was helpful for everyone else, but for me, it was the only experiences that I had that felt that connected were, intersecting in a Venn diagram with the church. So it just was like the most beautiful, meaningful stuff in my life. And therefore, I looked at who's the person that seems to be the most invested in this? Who's the person that's the leader in this? And those were priests.
And so then how did that desire or that dream to do that kind of work shift or change as you started to awaken to your queerness?
I was in college and was realizing multiple things at the same time, realizing what the church actually taught about women and becoming an adult woman and thinking like, I don't think so, and also going to Rome. I studied in Rome for a while. That was very impactful because it just gave me a sense of how much the church invested in, for instance, art or taking land from other folks. Because everything in Italy is so beautiful and so well positioned that it feels, there's like a level of pageantry that is awe-inspiring, but that also is, I started to realize was for show, that was intended to be awe-inspiring. And then thinking more about, trips that I thought I was going on that were service work, but I was in Jamaica and I was staying in a compound for Jesuit priests that was beachfront in Montego Bay. Like, why Jesuit priests would need beachfront land? It's that we were studying before going there, because everything had a social justice bent, how the Black Jamaicans that had been colonized until the 70s mostly lived inland, and how like the Señor Frogs were all external corporations that had come in and snapped up the best land. And I mean, all I could think was, oh, so then that means that I guess the church actually technically falls in that category too. And so I was just sort of realizing all of this at once. Like, it's a colonial organization that is trying to preserve wealth, create a sense of majesty, and that also is teaching me that as a woman and as a queer person, I'm less than. It was a pretty tough couple years realizing all of that.
So was it in the church where you started learning or being actively taught about social justice on those trips?
Yeah, I was a theology major, but I was a faith, peace, and justice minor, and, which is an actual very useful minor. It's always good to have a minor with an and some commas in it. Really lets you know it's going to be good for job prospects down the line. But yeah, I was learning about, I grew up in a conservative community, very white, very Republican, and I got the sort of Martin Luther King only version of education about like social justice in the world. And in college, the most radical folks I was reading about and learning about, most of them were still people working within the church, priests who were standing with like underrepresented groups of people in South and Central America, for instance. But then I think in breaking some thought patterns, then it was able to extrapolate that there's probably more thought patterns here to break. Like, it can't be that the church is always right and that, government is wrong.
It's just interesting to me that the very institution that taught you about all these things was kind of its own undoing in terms of your path.
Yeah, that's true. I completely agree. I mean, I also think at the same time, it's hard to like separate any of it out because it was all happening at the same time. The Spotlight investigation was happening in Boston. So I was also reading the newspaper and, very adept, well-researched articles about specifically my church, because the Archdiocese of Boston was technically the boss of the college I went to. And so that was happening. And then also, the L word was debuting on television. So I was seeing a queer community, a version of a queer community that didn't seem so scary and so disgusting. So this was all kind of happening at once. Seeing the more disgusting and shadier sides of what I believed was the one true thing, and then seeing the like fun, sexy, light, inclusive sides of the community I've been taught was so negative.
So given that on this show, I talk to a lot of people about their own spiritual path and where that has led them, I'm curious where that has led you in terms of your own spiritual beliefs or practice now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have really strong community right now, and I do consider myself a spiritual person. I have spiritual practices, but I don't think that organized religion will ever work for me again. I mean, we'll see. We don't know the future, but in any form, because it does seem that, I also was a comparative theology major, so this is something very helpful that also happened at the time. I wasn't just reading what Catholicism had to say. I was reading what other faiths had to say, and just sort of realized from that, it's, humans are reaching for meaning. That's the thing. That's also what like stand-up comedy is. The job that I do now is humans are reaching for meaning. We're trying to understand and organize the world around us. And I think that right now I am committed to community, and I'm not necessarily committed to tenets.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's where a lot of queer people end up, or they end up being drawn to spiritual practices or spiritual community, where it's kind of like, we're just gonna make it up and see what happens and see what works and see what fits and go from there. So you talked about community and being a stand-up comedian, and I've heard you talk about how it makes complete sense to me how you've talked about that being a stand-up comedian is sort of like the next best thing that you could do instead of being a priest. Because based on my own experiences of going to church as a child and hearing priests, some of them probably thought that they were comedians in some way. And so I just really appreciate how you're bringing these pieces together, and also learning that you went to school to be a social worker. I don't think you completed that, but that also makes sense to me. It's kind of like if you take sort of comedian and social worker and mash them up together, that's kind of what a priest is or can be sometimes.
Yeah, that's so funny. Right. I mean, I always say that I've always just been interested in the same thing. It's just like looked really different in terms of the outlet. But yes, right. So what I was interested in from the priesthood specifically was also leadership, and a priest like is injecting their personal thought. Yes, they like study the world around them, but then it's their opinion, it's their take on things. And social worker is in connection, interpersonal connection, and also in allocating resources and, in really looking at the world without sort of the fluffy distance that is God. It's really looking for like the practical that is God, if God is anything. And so for me, I tried both of those things on, and eventually found that stand-up was a place where I could do all that. I can connect with people after shows, usually because of the work. I have found that audience members are usually pretty impacted, or they like have stuff that they want to share with me. And so it really is like, some of it really is like a laying on of hands, like, sort of receiving other people's spirit or whatever. I mean, it really is. If I'm waiting to meet folks after, it kind of feels like ministry. I know that's wild to say, but I'm usually not the one saying anything at that point. It's usually people telling me their stories, and I'm just like a witness for that. So it does feel like a combination of the two jobs to me.
Do you intentionally bring sort of all those things together into your shows, all of your shows?
It's not intentional. It's just, unfortunately, I'm like a very earnest person and, really passionate and really emotional and really empathetic. And I can't be different than I am. I think some comics are operating at a distance from the audience, and that's what works for them. And for me, I'm like really trying to be the link. Not trying, it's just what's happening. I feel that I'm the link for the audience to connect with each other, as opposed to the person on stage separate. So it does feel like it's like being a conductor, sort of. And I feel very of use. None of that is anything that I'm intentionally doing. It's just like what's happening for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that in the work I've seen of yours. I haven't seen any of your live shows, and unfortunately, I wasn't not going to see you in San Francisco since the tour was canceled, but sometime soon. But I've seen your work on TV, and also other comedians I've seen who are starting to bring a little bit more of that authenticity and connection with the audience, and not so much like, I'm here and I'm the performer, and then they go off stage and they're a completely different person. And I also wanted to really talk briefly about the importance of language that I really hear you using a lot in a lot of your platforms. At the beginning of your podcast, you talk about language that people may use during the interview and to be open to interpretation of that. And then also in your special rape jokes, you talk a lot about the importance of language and the way that comedians use language. And I also think it's important within the queer community in terms of the language that we use, as you allude to in the podcast. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the way that you bring that into these different mediums.
I definitely can. Right. I think there's the framing for some of what you just asked is that a lot of comics have, and these are always like, not always, oftentimes, it is a cis straight white dude that we've heard this over the last bunch of years, speaking about how constrained they feel by having to update their language. This isn't just in comedy. I would say the same thing about politics, the same thing about your boss, wherever you happen to work. Like, it's that thing where they make a joke about having to care about sexual harassment, or where they make a joke about having to use specifically anti-racist language, things like that. So for me, I feel that I don't know, I do not do this perfectly because I'm a human being limited by my own experience and knowledge. And I have been challenged the entire time I've been doing my job to evolve. And so are so many people in the queer community. Like, we are a community. I think about the straight comic that's like, oh God, I can't use this word. That's the only word that's funny here. And I want to be like, imagine if your audience was the queer community, because we are so hyper vigilant about giving each other feedback. You know, I feel that I've been called out for language probably, you know, whatever it is, powers of 10 more than that straight guy. And that's okay. I don't know everything, you know, and I do hope that I continue to evolve because it's younger folks that buy tickets. This is another thing that is like so silly to me. You know, it's 18 to 35-year-olds are really the people who come see live performance the most and who consume the most TV. And if younger folks are using evolving language, it really is on us as performers to use that language because it benefits us. So like, if you don't want to do it because you're being respectful, which is something that I consider important, at the very least do it because it will positively impact your bottom line. You know, I can give you the read that's cynical and financially motivated, or I can give you the read that's like, let's be kind to each other because it's just as easy to be kind as it is to be shitty. But, you know, I mean, I don't do this job because I want things to be easy. I get frustrated just like anyone else. And I also chose a hard job on purpose.
Yeah. And I feel similar with my job, even though, you know, as a therapist, I have an audience of one, although I wouldn't really call them my audience because I'm mostly listening. But there are times when I may use language that they're like, oh, wait, that's not right for me in terms of how I feel, or that's not right for me in terms of my experience or how I identify. And I say, oh, okay, so let's talk about that. And maybe they don't know what is right for them, but they know what is not right for them. And so we use that as a place to explore that together. And so I just really appreciate you bringing that more into the public, into the community, and bringing that out into the world and the importance of that, not only in the queer community, but in the broader sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm imagining that as a therapist, you also don't want to just have every session be the same until you die.
Oh, no.
You know, I'm assuming that you actually benefit in some ways from having these conversations where there might be pushback or redirection. And that's just something I don't hear a lot of people talking about. How, you know, okay, so if nobody, I mean, I am a human being with feelings too. So sometimes I do get frustrated receiving pushback because I'm a person and I want you to like me, you know, like, you know, whatever. But I also think if every battle is going well for you, if everything you say is accepted, if every, like, what a boring life. You know, it just doesn't feel like, I just can't imagine why anybody would want to do a job where they aren't challenged. If we get to pick our jobs, which not everybody does.
True, exactly. Yeah. So, in full disclosure, I will confess that when I was just starting out my podcast, I was listening to a lot of other queer podcasts to hear how people were doing things and what I liked and what I didn't like. And I was very influenced by you. So you may recognize a variation of the next question I'm going to ask you, which I ask all of my guests, which is, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Oh my gosh. I do hear some similarities. You know, this is just a very specific one that I'm thinking of right now. I've been doing as this, so like I had this book coming out and then there was this book tour and then that book tour was canceled. So I've been doing these panels on Zoom where I have been able to reach out to folks who I really respect and they've come on the panel and just talked to me about the work that they do. So I had Roxane Gay on and Carmen Maria Machado and Lydia Palgren and Maggie Thrash in my first one, and then just a bunch of other amazing folks since then. And I think that really the experience that I am having and continue to have is I really feel that if I don't create community, it won't be there for me. That is like my default biggest fear, partially because when I came out, that really is what happened. You know, I was, for lack of a better word, you know, to really nail it, to really hit it on the head, I was abandoned by my faith community, my school, my friends, my family for a period of years, and not like quietly, like overtly. And so, I've had to really work through a fear of abandonment. So as a response to that, I've spent a lot of my life creating community. I create community. And part of that is because I'm afraid that if I don't, then there won't be a community that's there for me. And it's challenging and heartening for me to accept other people giving me their time. So it's been very challenging in this time to ask friends for help and say, will you come on this panel? I mean, I'm paying people. Like, I don't feel I'm like moving toward asking for a favor, but I'm not yet there in my evolution. But a lot of folks have come out to support me in this time, and that's hard for me to accept. I don't naturally want to accept help. I feel much more comfortable giving help. And I'm really grateful for this practice right now, the experience of accepting help from other people. It always is a difficult thing for me, and it always helps me grow.
And I imagine that for a lot of queer people, it can be scary to ask for help because of the history of rejection that we may have experienced. So I think that's true for a lot of people listening right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, as a society, if you live in the US, culturally, we're taught that like it's weak to ask for help. And then in the faith I grew up in, you're supposed to be of service, not receive services. But I will tell you, on a long enough time frame, number one, it's impossible to never receive service from other people. And number two, it makes you insufferable. Other people also want to give. Like you don't, if you're the one who's constantly giving, like you are actually a jackass on a long enough time frame. So I've been trying to be somebody who can receive help, because it's also nice to give other people the opportunity to give.
Yeah. Yeah, someone has to receive.
Exactly. Yes.
So Cameron, where can people find you and your book?
I'm at Cameron Esposito all across different platforms. I have got a podcast called Queery that you can listen to, that if you like this show, you probably would like. And my book, Save Yourself, is available everywhere, from Amazon and Audible to as an ebook on Apple Books. But one thing I'm really encouraging folks to do is, if you have an indie bookseller in your town, to order it from them, because right now that's the type of business that will be most affected by the shutdown. So you can buy it anywhere, but if you want to go the extra mile and Google around and find out if your local bookstore is open, I would really encourage that.
And on that note, I will give a little plug to, this is not an ad in any way, but a plug for a local independent bookseller that is quite popular in San Francisco, Green Apple Books. So check it out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Green Apple.
And do you have any more of your panels coming up in April that you have planned? I know you have some the rest of this week, but by the time this airs, I'm not sure what will be, if you have any more planned.
I don't know what will happen next. I don't think that I'll be doing the Zoom panels anymore, but I'm already planning to try to pivot more into a stand-up space after this book tour is over. So just, the best way right now to connect with any artist is looking at their socials, because everything has sort of broken down into direct information that way. So yeah, checking out my socials. I'm sure there's stuff that I've got going on that you can just easily log on to on things like Instagram Live.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Do you feel lost or stuck? Or are you alone on your healing journey? If you're seeking guidance or support, I'm here to help. I offer online coaching and counseling for queer spiritual folks from all over. Schedule your free consultation with me now by going to queerhealingjourneys.com. I look forward to supporting you on your path. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.